The book of Asher, we're continuing on, starting with chapter 11 through chapter 15. Chapter 11 talks about Nimrod's wicked reign, the idolatry of Terah, Abraham's father. When 50 years old, Abraham returns to his father's house and discovers his idols, makes a pretext to destroy them, and making savory meat for the gods, the wicked idols. Abraham takes a hatchet and destroys them, leaving the hatchet in the hands of the large one, where it discovered by his father, who is told by Abram that the great God has risen up in anger and destroyed his fellow. Terah, his father, in his wrath betrays Abraham to the king, who brings him up before the throne for judgment. Abraham warns his father and the king before all the princes of the evil of idolatry. Chapter 12 talks about Abraham placed in prison and is condemned after 10 days to be cast into a fiery furnace. His brother Haran, being falsely accused, is condemned to the same fate. As Haran's heart was not right before mighty God Ahiah, he perished. But Abram is delivered and is brought forth alive and is presented with many gifts. The king dreams of Abram and again seeks his life. Abram flees to the house of Noah. Chapter 13 talks about on Abram's account, Terah and all his house with Abram leave Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. They tarry in Haran, where mighty God Ahiah appears to Abram and upon condition of faithfulness promises many blessings to Abraham, commanded of mighty God Ahiah take his wife and all belonging to him, and goes to the land of Canaan, where mighty God Ahiah again appears to him and promises the land of Canaan as an everlasting inheritance. And after 15 years, Abram returned to Haran to visit his father, teaches many to walk in the way of mighty God Ahiah, again command to go to Canaan, where he builds an altar. Mighty God Ahiah renews his covenant with him. Chapter 14 talks about Rikayan's cunning device to make money of the Egyptians. And last of all, chapter 15 talks about on account of famine in Canaan, Abraham goes to Egypt, tells the people that Sarah is his sister. On account of her beauty, Pharaoh desires to take her, but is prevented by an angel of mighty God Ahiah. The truth is made known, and Sarah is restored to Abram with many presents. Abraham returned to his home, trouble between Lot and Abram on account of Lot's cattle. Lot removes to Sodom. So let's get into chapter 11. The book of Asher, chapter 11. And Nimrod, son of Cush, was still in the land of Shinar, and he reigned over it and dwelt there, and he built cities in the land of Shinar. And these are the names of the 4 cities which he built, and he called their names after the occurrences that happened to them in the building of the tower. And he called the first Babel, saying, because mighty God Ahiah there confounded the language of the whole earth. And the name of the second he called Erech, because from mighty God Ahiah dispersed them. And the third he called Eked, saying there was a great battle at that place. And the fourth he called Calna, because his prince and mighty men were consumed there, and they vexed mighty God Ahiah. They rebelled and transgressed against him. And when Nimrod had built these cities in the land of Shinar, he placed in them the remainder of his people, his princes and his mighty men that were left in his kingdom. And Nimrod dwelt in Babel, and he there renewed his reign over the rest of his subjects, and he reigned securely. And the subjects and princes of Nimrod called his name Amraphel, saying that the tower his princes and men fell through his means. And notwithstanding this, Nimrod did not return to mighty God Ahiah, and he continued in wickedness and teaching wickedness to the sons of men. And Mardon his son was worse than his father, and continued to add to the abominations of his father. And he caused the sons of men to sin. Therefore it is said, from the wicked goeth from wickedness. At that time there was a war between the families of the children of Ham, as they were dwelling in the cities which they had built. And Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, went away from the families of the children of Ham, and he fought with them, and he subdued them. And he went to the 5 cities of the plain, and he fought against them, and he subdued them, and they were under his control. And they served him 12 years, and they gave him a yearly tax. At that time died Nahor, son of Serug, in the 49th year of the life of Abram, son of Terah. And in the 50th year of the life of Abram, son of Terah, Abram came forth from the house of Noah and went to his father's house. And Abram knew mighty God Ahiah, and he went in his ways and instructions. And mighty God Ahiah, his mighty God, was with him. And Terah his father was in those days still captain of the host of King Nimrod, and he still followed strange gods. And Abram came to his father's house and saw 12 gods standing there in their temples, and the anger of Abram was kindled when he saw these images in his father's house. And Abram said, As mighty God Ahiah liveth, these images shall not remain in my father's house. So shall mighty God Ahiah, who created me, do unto me, if in 3 days' time I do not break them all. And Abram went from them, and his anger burned within him. And Abram hastened and went from the chamber of his father's outer court, and he found his father sitting in the court, and all his servants with him. And Abram came and sat before him. And Abram asked his father, saying, Father, tell me, where is mighty God Ahiah, who created heaven and earth, and all the sons of men upon the earth, and who created thee and me? And Terah answered his son Abram and said, Behold, those who created us are all with us in the house. And Abram said to his father, My Lord, show them to me, I pray thee. And Terah brought Abram into the chamber of the inner court, and Abram saw, and behold, the whole room was full of gods of wood and stone, 12 great images, and other less than they, without number. And Terah said to his son, Behold, these are they which made all thou seest upon earth, and which created me and thee and all mankind. And Terah bowed down to his gods, and he then went away from them, and Abram his son went away with him. And when Abram had gone forth them, he went to his mother and sat before her. And he said to his mother, Behold, my father has shown me those who made heaven and earth and all the sons of men. Now therefore hasten and fetch a kid from the flock, and make of it savory meat, that I may bring it to my father's gods as an offering for them to eat. Perhaps I may thereby become acceptable to them. And his mother did so, and she fetched a kid and made savory meat thereof, and brought it to Abram. And Abram took the savory meat from his mother, and brought it before his father's gods. And he drew nigh to them, that they might eat. And Terah his father did not know of it. And Abram saw on the day when he was sitting amongst them, that they had no voice, no hearing, no motion, and not one of them could stretch forth his hand to eat. And Abram mocked them, and saying, Surely the savory meat that I prepare has not pleased them, or perhaps it was too little for them, and for that reason they would not eat. Therefore tomorrow I will prepare fresh savory meat, better and more plentiful than this, in order that I may see the result. And it was on the next day that Abram directed his mother concerning the savory meat. And his mother rose and fetched 3 fine kids from the flock, and she made of them some excellent savory meat, such as her son was fond of, and she gave it to her son Abram, and Terah his father did not know of it. And Abram took the savory meat from his mother, and brought it before his father's gods in the chamber, and he came nigh unto them, that they might eat, and he placed it before them. And Abram sat before them all day, thinking perhaps they might eat. And Abram viewed them, and behold, they had neither voice nor hearing, nor did one of them stretch forth his hand to the meat to eat. And in the evening of that day in the house, Abram was clothed with the spirit of mighty God Ahiah. And he called out and said, Woe unto my father and this wicked generation, whose hearts are all inclined to vanity, who serve these idols of wood and stone, which can neither eat, smell, hear, nor speak, who have mouths without speech, eyes without sight, ears without hearing, hands without feeling, and legs which cannot move. Like them are those that made them, and that trust in them. And when Abram saw all these things, his anger was kindled against his father. And he hastened and took a hatchet in his hand, and came unto the chamber of the gods, and he broke all his father's gods. And when he had done breaking the images, he placed the hatchet in the hand of the great God, which was there before them. And he went out, and Terah his father came home, for he had heard at the door the sound of the striking of the hatchet. So Terah came into the house to know what this was about. And Terah, having heard the noise of the hatchet in the room of images, ran to the room to the images, and he met Abram going out. And Terah entered the room and found all the idols fallen down and broken, and the hatchet in the hand of the largest, which was not broken, and the savory meat which Abram his son had made was still before them. And when Terah saw this, his anger was greatly kindled, and he had hastened and went from the room to Abram. And he found Abram his son still sitting in the house, and he said to him, What is this work thou hast done to my gods? And Abram answered Terah his father, and he said, Not so, my lord, for I brought savory meat before them, and when I came nigh to them with the meat that they might eat, they all at once stretched forth their hands to eat before the great one had put forth his hand to eat. And the large one saw their works that they did before him, and his anger was violently kindled against them. And he went and took the hatchet that was in the house, and came to them and broke them all. And behold, the hatchet is yet in his hand, as thou seest. And Terah's anger was kindled against his son Abram. When he spoke this, and Terah said to Abram his son in his anger, What is this tale that thou hast told? Thou speakest lies to me. Is there in these gods spirit, soul, or power to do all thou hast told me? Or are they not wood and stone, and have I not myself made them? And canst thou speak such lies, saying that the Lord God that was with them smote them? Is it thou that didst place this hatchet in his hand, and then sayest he smote them all? And Abram answered his father and said unto him, And how canst thou then serve these idols, in whom there is no power to do anything? Can those idols in which thou trusted deliver thee? Can they hear thy prayers when thou callest upon them? Can they deliver thee from the hands of thy enemies? Or will they fight thy battles for thee against thy enemies? That thou shouldest serve wood and stone, which can neither speak nor hear. And now surely it is not good for thee, nor for the sons of men that are connected with thee, to do these things. Or you so silly, so foolish, or so short of understanding, that you will serve wood and stone, and do after this manner? And I forget that mighty God Ahiah who made, and forget mighty God Ahiah who made heaven and earth, and who created you in the earth, and thereby bring a great evil upon your soul in the matter by serving stone and wood? Did not our fathers in the days of old sin in this matter? And mighty God Ahiah of the universe brought the waters of the flood upon them, and destroyed the whole earth. And how can you continue to do this, and serve gods of wood and stone, who cannot hear or speak or deliver you from oppression, thereby bringing down the anger of mighty God Ahiah of the universe upon you? Now therefore, my father, refrain from this, and bring not evil upon thy soul and the souls of thy household. And Abram hastened and sprang forth before his father, and took the hatchet from his father's largest idol, with which Abram broke it, and ran away. And Terah, seeing all that Abram had done, hastened to go from his house, and he went to the king, and he came before Nimrod, and stood before him, and he bowed down to the king, and the king said, What thou dost want? And he said, I beseech thee, my lord, to hear me. Now 50 years back a child was born to me, and thus has he done to my gods, and thus has he spoken. And now therefore, my lord and king, send for him, that he may come before thee, and judge him according to thy law, that we may be delivered from his evil. And the king sent 3 men of his servants, and they went and brought Abram before the king. And Nimrod and all his princes and servants were that day sitting before him, and Terah sat also before them. And the king said to Abram, What is this that thou hast done to thy father and to his gods? And Abram answered the king in the words that he spoke to his father, and he said, The Lord God that was with them in the house did to them what thou hast heard. And the king said to Abram, Had they power to speak and eat and do as thou hast said? And Abraham answered the king, saying, And if there be no power in them, why dost thou serve them, and cause the sons of men to err through thy follies? Dost thou imagine that they can deliver thee or do anything small or great, that thou shouldest serve them? And why wilt thou not sense, mighty God Ahai of the whole universe, who created thee and in whose power it is to kill and keep alive? O foolish, simple, and ignorant king, woe unto thee forever. I thought thou wouldest teach thy servant the upright way, but thou hast done this, but hast filled the whole earth with thy sins and the sins of thy people who have followed thy ways. Dost thou not know, or hast thou not heard, that this evil which thou doest, our ancestors sinned therein the days of old, and the eternal mighty God Ahai brought the waters of the flood upon them and destroyed them all, and also destroyed the whole earth on their account? And wilt thou and thy people rise up now and do like unto this work, in order to bring down the anger of mighty God Ahai of the universe, and to bring evil upon thee the whole earth? Now therefore put away this evil deed which thou doest, and serve mighty God Ahai of the universe, as thy soul is in his hands, and then it will be well with thee. And if thy wicked heart will not hearken to my words, to cause thee to forsake thy evil ways, and to serve the eternal mighty God, then wilt thou die in shame in the latter days, thou, thy people, and all who are connected with thee, hearing thy words or walking in the evil ways. And when Abram had ceased speaking before the king and princes, Abram lifted up his eyes to the heaven and said, Ahai seeth all the wicked, and he will judge them. Chapter 12. And when the king heard the words of Abram, he ordered him to be put into prison, and Abram was 10 days in prison. And at the end of those days, the king ordered that all the kings, princes, and governors of different provinces and the sages should come before him, and they sat before him, and Abram was still in the house of confinement. And the king said to the princes and sages, Have you heard what Abram the son of Terah has done to his father? Thus has he done to him, and I ordered him to be brought before me, and thus has he spoken. His heart did not misgive him, neither did he stir in my presence, and behold, now he is confined in prison. And therefore decide what judgment is due to this man who reviled the king, who spoke and did all the things that you heard. And they all answered the king, saying, The man who reviled the king should be hanged upon a tree. But having done all the things that he said, and having despised our gods, he must therefore be burned to death. For this is the law in this manner. If it pleases the king to do this, let him order his servants to kindle a fire both night and day in thy brick furnace, and then we will cast this man into it. And the king did so, and he commanded his servants that they should prepare a fire for 3 days and 3 nights in the king's furnace that is in Casdim. And the king ordered them to take Abram from prison and bring him out to be burned. And all the king's servants, princes, lords, governors, and judges, and all the inhabitants of the land, about 900,000 men, stood opposite the furnace to see Abram. And all the women and little ones crowded upon the roofs and towers to see what was doing with Abram. And they all stood together at a distance, and there was not a man left that did not come on that day to behold the scene. And when Abram was come, the conjurers of the king and the sages saw Abram, and they cried out to the king, saying, O sovereign Lord, surely this is the man whom we know to have been the child at whose birth the great star swallowed the 4 stars, which we declared to the king now 50 years since. And behold, now his father has also transgressed thy commands, and mocked thee by bringing thee another child, which thou didst kill. And when the king heard their words, he was exceedingly wroth, and he ordered Terah to be brought before him. And the king said, Hast thou heard what the conjurers have spoken? Now tell me truly how this thou, and if thou shalt speak truth, thou shalt be acquitted. And seeing that the king's anger was so much kindled, Terah said to the king, My lord and king, thou hast heard the truth, and what the sages have spoken is right. And the king said, How couldst thou do this thing, to transgress my orders, and to give me a child that thou did not beget, and take value for him? And Terah answered the king, because my tender feelings were excited for my son at that time, and I took a son of my handmaid, and I brought him to the king. And the king said, Who advised thee to do this? Tell me. Do not hide aught from me, and then thou shalt not die. And Terah was greatly terrified in the king's presence, and he said to the king, It was Haran, my eldest son, who advised me to this. And Haran was in those days that Abram was born 32 years old. But Haran did not advise his father to anything. For Terah said this to the king in order to deliver his soul from the king, for he feared greatly. And the king said to Terah, Haran thy son, who advised thee to this, shall die through fire with Abram. For the sentence of death is upon him for having rebelled against the king's desire in doing this thing. And Haran at that time felt inclined to follow the ways of Abram, but he kept it within himself. And Haran said in his heart, Behold, now the king has seized Abram on account of these things which Abram did, and it shall come to pass that if Abram prevail over the king, I will follow him, but if the king prevail, I will go after the king. And when Terah had spoken this to the king concerning Haran his son, the king ordered Haran to be seized with Abram. And they brought them both, Abram and Haran his brother, to cast them into the fire, and all the inhabitants of the land, and the king's servant, and princes, and all the women and little ones were there, standing that day over them. And the king's servant took Abram and his brother, and they stripped them of all their clothes, excepting their lower garments which were upon them. And they bound their hands and feet with linen cords, and the servants of the king lifted them up and cast them both into the furnace. And mighty God Ahiah loved Abram, and he had compassion over him. And mighty God Ahiah came down and delivered Abram from the fire, and he was not burned. But all the cords which they bound him were burned, while Abram remained and walked about in the fire. And Haran died when they had cast him into the fire, and he was burned to ashes, for his heart was not perfect with mighty God Ahiah. And those men who cast him into the fire, the flame of the fire spread over them, and they were burned, and 12 men of them died. And Abram walked in the midst of the fire 3 days and 3 nights, and all the servants of the king saw him walking in the fire. And they came and told the king, saying, Behold, we have seen Abram walking about in the midst of the fire, and even the lower garments which are upon him are not burned, but the cords with which he was bound is burned. And when the king heard their words, his heart fainted, and he would not believe them. So he sent other faithful princes to see this matter, and they went and saw it and told it to the king. And the king rose to go and see it, and he saw Abram walking to and fro in the midst of the fire, and he saw Aaron's body burn, and the king wondered greatly. And the king ordered Abram to be taken out from the fire, and his servants approached to take him out of. They could not, for the fire was round about, and the flame ascending toward them from the furnace. And the king's servant fled from it, and the king rebuked them, saying, Make haste and bring Abram out of the fire, that you should not die. And the servants of the king again approached to bring Abram out, and the flames came upon them and burned their faces, so that 8 of them died. And when the king saw that his servants could not approach the fire, lest they should be burned, the king called to Abram, O servant of mighty God Ahiah, who is in heaven, go forth from amidst the fire, and come hither before me. And Abram hearkened to the voice of the king, and he went forth from the fire, and came and stood before the king. And when Abram came out, the king and all his servants saw Abram coming before the king, with his lower garments upon him, for they were not burned, but the cords with which he was bound was burned. And the king said to Abram, How is it that thou wast not burned in the fire? And Abram said to the king, Mighty God Ahiah of heaven and earth, in whom I trust, and who has all in his power, he delivered me from the fire into which thou didst cast me. And Abram, the brother of Abram, was burned to ashes, and they sought for his body, and they found it consumed. And Abram was 82 years old when he died in the fire of Kasdan. And the king, princes, and inhabitants of the land, seeing that Abram was delivered from the fire, they came and bowed down to Abram. And Abram said to them, Do not bow down to me, but bow down to mighty God Ahiah of the world, who made you, and serve him, and go in his ways, for it is he who delivered me from out of the fire, and it is he who created the souls and spirits of all men, and formed man in his mother's womb, and brought him forth into the world. And it is he who will deliver those who trust in him from all pain. Blessed be his name. And this thing seemed very wonderful in the eyes of the king and princes, that Abram was saved from the fire, and that Haran was burned. And the king gave Abram many presents, and he gave him his 2 head servants from the king's house. The name of one was Ani, and the other name of the other Eleazar. And all the king, princes, and servants gave Abram many gifts of silver and gold and pearl. And the king and his princes sent him away, and he went in peace. And Abram went forth from the king in peace, and many of the king's servants followed him, and about 300 men joined. And Abram returned on that day and went to his father's house, he and the men that followed him. And Abram served mighty God Ahiah his king all the days of his life, and he walked in his ways and followed his law. And from that day forward, Abram inclined the hearts of the sons of men to serve mighty God Ahiah. And at that time Nahor and Abram took unto themselves wives, the daughter of their brother Haran. The wife of Nahor was Milcah, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And Sarai, wife of Abram, was barren. She had no offspring in those days. And at the expiration of 2 years from Abram's going out of the fire, that is in the 52nd year of his life, behold, King Nimrod sat in Babel upon the throne, and the king fell asleep, and dreamed that he was standing with his troops and hosts in a valley opposite the king's furnace. And he lifted up his eyes and saw a man in the likeness of Abram coming forth from the furnace, and that he came and stood before the king with his drawn sword, and then sprang to the king with his sword. When the king fled from the man, for he was afraid, and while he was running, the man threw an egg upon the king's head, and the egg became a great river. And the king dreamed that all his troops sank in that river and died. And the king took flight when 3 men who were before him, and he escaped. And the king looked at these men, and they were clothed in princely dresses as the garments of kings, and had the appearances of majesty of kings. And while they were running, the river again turned to an egg before the king, and there came forth from the egg a young bird, which came before the king, and flew at his head, and plucked out the king's eyes. And the king was grieved at the sight, and he awoke out of his sleep, and his spirit was agitated, and he felt a great terror. And in the morning the king rose from his couch in fear, and he ordered all the wise men and magicians to come before him, when the king related his dream to them. And a wise servant of the king, whose name was Anuki, answered the king, saying, This is nothing else but the evil of Abram and his seed, which will spring up against mighty God Ahiah and king in the latter days. And behold, the day will come when Abram and his seed and the children of the household will war with my king, and they will smite all the king's host and his troops. And as to what thou hast said concerning 3 men which thou didst see like unto thyself, and which did escape, this means that only thou wilt escape with 3 kings from the king of the earth, who will be with thee in battle. And that which thou sawest of the river, which turned to an egg as at first, and the young bird plucking out thine eye, this means nothing else but the seed of Abram, which will slay the king in latter days. This is my king's dream, and this is its interpretation, and the dream is true, and the interpretation which thy servant has given thee is right. Now therefore, my king, surely thou knowest that it is Now 52 years since thy sages saw this at the birth of Abram, and if my king will suffer Abram to live in the earth, it will be to the injury of my lord and king. For all the days that Abram liveth, neither thou nor thy kingdom will be established. For this was known formerly at his birth, and why will not my king slay him, that his evil may be kept from thee in latter days? And Nimrod hearkened to the voice of Anuki, and he sent some of his servants in secret to go and seize Abram and bring him before the king to suffer death. And Eleazar, Abram's servant, who the king had given him, was at that time in the presence of the king, and he heard what Anuki had advised the king, and what the king had said to cause Abram's death. And Eleazar said to Abram, Hasten, rise up, and save thy soul, that thou mayest not die through the hands of the king. For thus did he see in a dream concerning thee, and thus did Anuki interpret it, and thus also did Anuki advise the king concerning thee. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Eleazar, and Abram hastened and ran for safety to the house of Noah and his son Shem. And he concealed himself there and found a place of safety. And the king's servant came to Abram's house to seek him, but they could not find him. And they searched throughout the country, and he was not to be found. And they went and searched in every direction, and he was not to be met with. And when the king's servant could not find Abram, they returned to the king. But the king's anger against Abram was still, as they did not find him. And the king drove from his mind this matter concerning Abram. And Abram was concealed in Noah's house for 1 month, until the king had forgotten this matter. But Abram was still afraid of the king, and terror came to see Abram his son secretly in the house of Noah, and terror was very great in the eyes of the king. And Abram said to his father, Dost thou not know that the king thinketh to slay me, and to annihilate my name from the earth by the advice of his wicked counselors? Now whom hast thou here, and what hast thou in this land? Arise, let us go together to the land of Canaan, that we may be delivered from his hand, lest thou perish also through him in the latter days. Dost thou not know, or hast thou not heard, that it is not through love that Nimrod giveth thee all this honor, but it is only for his benefit that he bestoweth all this good upon thee? And if he do unto thee greater good than this, surely these are only vanities of the world, for wealth and riches cannot avail in the day of wrath and anger. Now therefore hearken to my voice, and let us arise and go to the land of Canaan, out of the reach of injury from Nimrod, and serve thou mighty God Ahiah, who created thee in the earth, and it will be well with thee, and cast away all the vain things which thou pursuest. And Abram ceased to speak, when Noah and his son Shem answered Terah, saying, True is the word which Abram had said unto thee. And Terah hearkened to the voice of his son Abram, and Terah did all that Abram said, for this was mighty God Ahiah, that the king should not cause Abram's death. Chapter 13. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, the wife of his son Abram, and all the souls of his household, and went with them from Kasdan to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came as far as the land of Haran, they remained there, for it was exceedingly good land for pasture, and of sufficient extent for those who accompanied them. And the people of the land of Haran saw that Abram was good and upright with mighty God Ahiah and men, and that mighty God Ahiah his king was with him. And some of the people of the land of Haran came and joined Abram, and he taught them in the instructions of mighty God Ahiah and his ways. And these men remained with Abram in his house, and they adhered to him. And Abram remained in the land 3 years, and at the expiration of 3 years, mighty God Ahiah appeared to Abram and said to him, I am mighty God Ahiah, who brought thee forth from Kasdan, and delivered thee from the hands of all thine enemies. And now therefore, if thou wilt hearken to my voice, and keep my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, then I will cause thine enemies to fall before thee. And I will multiply thy seed like the stars of heaven, and I will send my blessing upon all the works of thy hands, and thou shalt lack nothing. Arise now, and take thy wife and all belongings to thee, and go to the land of Canaan, and remain there. And I will there be unto thee for a mighty God and King, and I will bless thee. And Abram rose and took his wife and all belongings to him, and he went to the land of Canaan, as mighty God Ahai had told him. And Abram was 50 years old when he went from Haran. And Abram came to the land of Canaan, and dwelt in the midst of the city, and he there pitched his tent amongst the children of Canaan, inhabitants of the land. And mighty God Ahai appeared to Abram when he came to the land of Canaan, and said to him, This is the land which I gave unto thee and to thy seed after thee forever. And I will make thy seed like the stars of heaven, and I will give unto thee thy seed for an inheritance in all the land which thou seest. And Abram built an altar in the place where mighty God Ahai had spoken to him, and Abram there called upon the name of mighty God Ahai. And at that time, at the end of 3 years of Abram's dwelling in the land of Canaan, in that year Noah died, which was the 58th year of the life of Abram. And all the days that Noah lived were 950 years, and he died. And Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, he, his wife, and all belonging to him, and all those that accompany him, together with those that join him from the people of the land. But Nahor, Abram's brother, and Terah his father, and Lot the son of Haran, and all belonging to them dwelt in Haran. In the 5th year of Abram's dwelling in the land of Canaan, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the cities of the plain revolted from the power of Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, for all the king of the cities of the plain had served Chedorlaomer for 12 years, and gave him a yearly tax. But in those days, in the 13th year, they rebelled against him. And in the 10th year of Abram's dwelling in the land of Canaan, there was a war between Nimrod king of Shinar and Chedorlaomer king of Elam. And Nimrod came to fight with Chedorlaomer and to subdue him. For Chedorlaomer was at that time one of the princes of the host of Nimrod. And when all the people at the tower were dispersed, and those that remained were also scattered upon the face of the earth, Chedorlaomer went to the land of Elam and reigned over it, and rebelled against his lord. And in those days, when Nimrod saw that the cities of the plain had rebelled, he came with pride and anger to war with Chedorlaomer. And Nimrod assembled all his princes and subjects, about 700,000 men, and went against Chedorlaomer. And Chedorlaomer went out to meet him with 5,000 men, and they prepared for battle in the valley of Babel, which is between Elam and Shinar. And all those kings fought there, and Nimrod and his people were smitten before the people of Chedorlaomer, and there fell from Nimrod's men about 600,000, and Mardon, the king's son, fell amongst them. And Nimrod fled and returned in the shame and disgrace to his land, and he was under subjection to Chedorlaomer for a long time. And Chedorlaomer returned to his land, and set princes of his host to the kings that dwelt around him, and Arioch king of Elazar, and to Tidal king of Goyim, and made a covenant with them, and they were all obedient to his commands. And it was in the 15th year of Abram's dwelling in the land of Canaan, which is the 70th year of the life of Abram, and mighty God Ahai appeared to Abram in the year, and he said to him, I am mighty God Ahai, who brought thee out from Kasdan to give thee this land for an inheritance. Now therefore walk before me, and be perfect, and keep my commands, for to thee and to thy seed I will give this land for an inheritance, from the river Mitzrayim unto the great river Euphrates. And thou shalt come to thy father in peace and in good age, and the 4th generation shall return here in this land, and shall inherit it forever. And Abram built an altar, and he called upon the name of mighty God Ahai, who appeared to him, and he brought up sacrifices upon the altar to mighty God Ahai. At that time Abram returned and went to Haran to see his father and mother, and his father's house. And Abram and his wife and all belonging to him returned to Haran. And Abram dwelt in Haran 5 years. And many of the people of Haran, about 72 men, followed Abram, and Abram taught them the instructions of mighty God Ahai and his ways, and he taught them to know mighty God Ahai. In those days mighty God Ahai appeared to Abram in Haran, and he said to him, Behold, I spoke unto thee these 20 years back, saying, Go forth from thy land, from thy birthplace, and from thy father's house to the land which I have shown thee, to give it to thee and to thy children. For there in that land will I bless thee, and make thee a great nation, and make thy name great, and in thee shall the families of the earth be blessed. Now therefore arise, go forth from this place, thou, thy wife, and all belonging to thee, also every one born in thy house, and all thy souls thou hast made in Haran, and bring them out with thee from here, and arise to return to the land of Canaan. And Abram arose and took his wife Sarai, and all belonging to him, and all that were born to him in his house, and the souls which they had made in Haran, and they came out to go to the land of Canaan. And Abram went and returned to the land of Canaan, according to the word of mighty God Ahai, and Lot the son of his brother Haran went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he went forth from Haran to return to the land of Canaan. And he came to the land of Canaan according to the word of mighty God Ahai to Abram, and he pitched his tent, and he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, and with him was Lot, his brother's son, and all belonging to him. And mighty God Ahai again appeared to Abram, and said, To thy seed will I give this land. And he that built an altar to mighty God Ahai, who appeared to him, which is still to this day in the plains of Mamre. Chapter 14. In those days there was in the land of Shinar a wise man who had understanding in all wisdom, and of a beautiful appearance, but he was poor and indigent. His name was Rikayon, and he was hard set to support himself. And he resolved to go to Egypt, to Osiris, the son of Anan, king of Egypt, to show the king his wisdom, for perhaps he might find grace in his sight to raise him up and give him maintenance. And Rikayon did so. And when Rikayon came to Egypt, he asked the inhabitants of Egypt concerning the king, and the inhabitants of Egypt told him the customs of the king of Egypt. For it was then the custom of the king of Egypt that he went from his royal palace and was seen abroad only one day in the year, and after that the king would return to his palace to remain there. And on that day when the king went forth by past judgment in the land, and every one having a suit came before the king that day to obtain his request. And when Rikayon heard of the custom in Egypt, and that he could not come into the presence of the king, he grieved greatly and was very sorrowful. And in the evening Rikayon went out and found a house in ruins, formerly a baked house in Egypt. And he abode there all night in bitterness of soul, and pinched with hunger, and sleep was removed from his eyes. And Rikayon considered within himself what he should do in the town until the king made his appearance, and how he might maintain himself there. And he arose in the morning and walked about, and met in his way those who sowed vegetables and various sorts of seed, with which they supplied the inhabitants. And Rikayon wished to do the same in order to get a maintenance in the city, but he was unacquainted with the custom of the people, and he was like a blind man among them. And he went and obtained vegetables to sell them for his support, and the rabble assembled about him and ridiculed him, and took his vegetables from him, and left him nothing. And he rose up from there in bitterness of soul, and went sighing to the bake house in which he had remained all the night before, and he slept there the second night. And on that night again he reasoned within himself how he could save himself from starvation, and he devised a scheme how to act. And he rose up in the morning and acted ingeniously, and went and hired 30 strong men of the rabble, carrying their war instruments in their hand, and he led them to the top of the Egyptian sepulchre, and he placed them there. And he commanded them, saying, Thus says the king, strengthen yourselves and be valiant men, and let no man be buried here until 200 pieces of silver be given, and then he may be buried. And those men did according to the order of Richion to the people of Egypt the whole of that year. And in 8 months' time Richion and his men gathered great riches of silver and gold, and Richion took a great quantity of horses and other animals, and he hired more men, and he gave them horses, and they remained with him. And when the year came round, at the time the king went forth into the town, all the inhabitants of Egypt assembled together to speak to him concerning the work of Richion and his man. And the king went forth on the appointed day, and all the Egyptians came before him and cried unto him, saying, May the king live forever. What is this thing thou doest in the town to thy servant, not to suffer a dead body to be buried into such much silver and gold be given? Was there ever the like unto this done in the whole earth? For the days of former kings, yea, even from the days of Adam unto this day, that the dead should not be buried only for a set price. We know it to be the custom of kings to take a yearly tax from the living, but thou dost not only do this, but from the dead also, and to exercise a tax day by day. Now, O king, we can no more bear this, for the whole city is ruined on this account, and dost thou not know it? And when the king heard all that they had spoken, he was very wroth, and his anger burned within him at this affair, for he had known nothing of it. And the king said, Who and where is he that dares to do this wicked thing in my land without my command? Surely you will tell me. And they told him all the works of Richion and his men, and the king's anger was aroused, and he ordered Richion and his men to be brought before him. And Richion took about 1,000 children, sons and daughters, and clothed them in silk and embroidery, and he set them upon horses and sent them to the king by means of his men. And he also took a great quantity of silver and gold and precious stones, and a strong and beautiful horse as a present for the king, with which he came before the king and bowed down to the earth before him. And the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt wondered at the works of Richion, and they saw his riches and the presents that he had brought to the king. And it greatly pleased the king, and he wondered at it. And when Richion sat before him, the king asked him concerning all his works, and Richion spoke all his words wisely before the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt. And when the king heard the words of Richion and his wisdom, Richion found grace in his sight, and he met with grace and kindness from all the servants of the king and from all the inhabitants of Egypt, on account of his wisdom and excellent speeches, and from that time they loved him exceedingly. And the king answered and said to Richion, Thy name shall no more be called Richion, but Pharaoh shall be thy name, since thou didst exact a tax from the dead. And he called his name Pharaoh. And the king and his subjects loved Richion for his wisdom, and they consulted with all the inhabitants of Egypt to make him perfect under the king. And all the inhabitants of Egypt and its wise men did so, and it was made a law in Egypt. And they made Richion Pharaoh perfect prefect under Osrius, king of Egypt, and Richion Pharaoh, governor of Egypt, daily administering justice to the whole city. But Osrius the king would judge the people of the land one day in the year, when he went out to make his appearance. And Richion Pharaoh cunningly absurd the government of Egypt, and he exacted a tax from all the inhabitants of Egypt. And all the inhabitants of Egypt greatly loved Richion Pharaoh, and they made a decree to call every king that should reign over them and their seat in Egypt Pharaoh. Therefore all the kings that reigned in Egypt from this time forward were called Pharaoh unto this day. Chapter 15, the last chapter for today. And in that year there was a heavy famine throughout the land of Canaan, and the inhabitants of the land could not remain on account of the famine, for it was very grievous. And Abram and all belonging to him arose and went down to Egypt on account of the famine. And when they were at the brook of Mizraim, They remained there some time to rest from the fatigue of the road. And Abram and Sarai were walking at the border of the brook of Mitzrayim, and Abram beheld his wife Sarai that she was very beautiful. And Abram said to his wife Sarai, since mighty God Ahai had created thee with such a beautiful countenance, I am afraid of the Egyptians, lest they should slay me and take thee away from the fear of mighty God Ahai is not in these places. Surely then thou shalt do this, say thou art my sister, to all that may ask thee, in order that it may be well with me, and that we may live and not be put to death. And Abram commanded the same to all those that came with him into Egypt on account of the famine. Also his nephew Lot he commanded, saying, if the Egyptians ask thee concerning Sarai, say she is the sister of Abram. And yet with all these orders Abram did not put confidence in them, but he took Sarai and placed her in a chest and concealed it amongst their vessels. For Abram was greatly concerned about Sarai on account of the wickedness of the Egyptians. And Abram and all belonging to him rose up from the brook of Mizraim and came to Egypt. And they had scarcely entered the gates of the city when the guard stood up to them, saying, give tithes to the king from what you have, and then you may come into the town. And Abram and those that were with him did so. And Abram with the people that were with him came to Egypt. And when they came, they brought the chest in which Sarai was concealed, and the Egyptians saw the chest. And the king's servant approached Abram, saying, what hast thou here in this chest, which we have not seen? Now open thou the chest, and give tithe to the king of all that it contains. And Abram said, the chest I will not open, but all you demand upon it I will give. And Pharaoh's officers answered Abram, saying, it is a chest of precious stones. Give us the chest tenth thereof. Abram said, all that you desire I will give, but you must not open the chest. And the king's officers pressed Abram, and they reached the chest and opened it with force. And they saw, and behold, a beautiful woman was in the chest. And when the officers of the kings beheld Sarai, they were struck with admiration at her beauty. And all the princes and servants of Pharaoh assembled to see Sarai, for she was very beautiful. And the king's officers ran and told Pharaoh all that they had seen, and they praised Sarai to the king. And Pharaoh ordered her to be brought, and the woman came before the king. And Pharaoh beheld Sarai, and she pleased him exceedingly, and he was struck with her beauty. And the king rejoiced greatly on her account, and made presents to those who brought him the tidings concerning her. And the woman was then brought to Pharaoh's house, and Abram grieved on account of his wife, and he prayed to mighty God Ahai to deliver her from the hands of Pharaoh. And Sarai also prayed at that time, and said, O mighty God Ahai, my king, thou didst tell my lord Abram to go from his land and from his father's house to the land of Canaan, and thou didst promise to do well with him if he would perform thy commands. Now, behold, we have done that which thou hast commanded us, and we left our land and our families, and we went to a strange land and to a people whom we have not known before. And we came to this land to avoid the famine, and this evil accident has befallen me. Now therefore, my mighty God, Ahai and King, deliver us and save us from the hand of this oppressor, and do well with me for the sake of thy mercy. And mighty God Ahai hearkened to the voice of Sarai, and mighty God Ahai sent an angel to deliver Sarai from the power of Pharaoh. And the king came and sat before Sarai, and behold, an angel of mighty God Ahai was standing over them. And he appeared to Sarai and said to her, do not fear, for mighty God Ahai has heard thy prayer. And the king approached Sarai and said to her, what is this man to thee who brought thee hither? And she said, he is my brother. And the king said, it is incumbent upon us to make him great, to elevate him, and to do unto him all the good which thou shalt command us. And at that time the king sent to Abram silver and gold and precious stones in abundance, together with cattle, men, servants, and maidservants. And the king ordered Abram to be brought, and he sat in the court of the king's house. And the king greatly exalted Abram on that night. And the king approached to speak to Sarai, and he reached out his hand to touch her, when the angel smote him heavily, and he was terrified, and he refrained from reaching to her. And when the king came near to Sarai, the angel smote him to the ground, and acted thus to him the whole night, and the king was terrified. And the angel on that night smote heavily all the servants of the king and his whole household on account of Sarai, and there was a great lamentation that night amongst the people of Pharaoh's house. And Pharaoh, seeing the evil that befell him, said, Surely on account of this woman has this thing appeared to me. And he removed himself at some distance from her, and spoke pleasing words to her. And the king said to Sarai, Tell me, I pray thee, concerning the man with whom thou camest here. And Sarai said, This man is my husband. And I said to thee that he was my brother, for I was afraid lest thou shouldest put him to death through wickedness. And the king kept away from Sarai, and the plagues of the angel of mighty God Ahijah ceased from him and his household. And Pharaoh knew that he was smitten on account of Sarai, and the king was greatly astonished at this. And in the morning the king called for Abram and said to him, What is thou hast done to me? Why didst thou say she is my sister, owing to which I took her unto me for a wife? And this heavy plague has therefore come upon me and my household. Now therefore here is thy wife, take her and go from our land, lest we all die on her account. And Pharaoh took more cattle, men, servants, and maidservants, and silver and gold to give to Abram, and he returned unto his Sarai his wife. And the king took a maiden who he begat by his concubines, and he gave her to Sarai for a handmaid, Hagar. And the king said to his daughter, It is better for thee, my daughter, to be a handmaid in this man's house than to be mistress in my house, after we have beheld the evil that befell us on account of this woman. And Abram arose, and he and all belonging to him went away from Egypt. And Pharaoh ordered some of his men to accompany him, and all that went with him. And Abram returned to the land of Canaan, to the place where he had made the altar, where he had first had pitched his tent. And Lot the son of Haran, Abram's brother, had a heavy stock of cattle, flocks, and herds, and tents, for mighty God Ahijah was bountiful to them on account of Abram. And when Abram was dwelling in the land of the herdsmen of Lot, quarreled with the herdsmen of Abram, for their property was too great for them to remain together in the land, and the land could not bear them on account of their cattle. And when Abram's herdsmen went to feed their flock, they would not go into the fields of the people of the land, but the cattle of Lot's herdsmen did otherwise, for they were suffered to feed in the fields of the people of the land. And the people of the land saw this occurrence daily, and they came to Abram and quarreled with him on account of Lot's herdsmen. And Abram said to Lot, What is this thou hast doing to me, to make me despicable to the inhabitants of the land? And thou orderest thy herdsmen to feed thy cattle in the fields of other people? Dost thou not know that I am a stranger in the land amongst the children of Canaan? And why wilt thou do this unto me? And Abram quarreled daily with Lot on account of this. But Lot would not listen to Abram, and he continued to do the same. And the inhabitants of the land came and told Abram. And Abram said to Lot, How long wilt thou be to me for a stumbling block with the inhabitants of the land? Now I beseech thee, let there be no more quarreling between us, for we are kinsmen. But I pray thee, separate from me, go and choose a place where thou mayest dwell with thy cattle and belonging to thee, but keep thyself at a distance from me, thou and thy household. And be not afraid in going from me, for if any one do an injury to thee, let me know, and I will avenge thy cause from him. Only remove from me. And Abram had spoken all these words to Lot. Then Lot arose and lifted up his eyes toward the plain of Jordan. And he saw that the whole of this place was well watered and good for a man, as well as a fording pasture for the cattle. And Lot went from Abram to that place, and he there pitched his tent, and he dwelt in Sodom, and they were separated from each other. And Abram dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and he pitched his tent there, and Abram remained in that place many years. And that's the end of chapter 15. We will continue tomorrow. Thank you for listening.